After 30 years of faithful service, Tom Delaney thought he'd earned the right to finish his career quietly. The 54-year-old staff sergeant was just weeks from retirement when something began moving under his skin. At Fort Braxton in the Appalachian Mountains, the base clinic had seen everything from training injuries to combat wounds. But when Tom rolled up his sleeve that morning, what crawled out of his wrist left the medic speechless. His last mission was simple reconnaissance check. An old Cold War bunker and file a report. Tom had walked those dark concrete halls alone, just doing his job like he had for 3 decades. Now something was eating him alive from the inside. As the infection spreads and other soldiers start showing symptoms, the base doctor realizes this isn't a medical emergency. Could a forgotten government experiment from the 1950s still be claiming victims today? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk. The morning mist clung to the peaks surrounding Fort Braxton like memories that wouldn't fade. Staff Sergeant Tom Delaney had watched countless sunrises paint these Appalachian ridges in shades of amber and gold. But today, the familiar view from his barracks window felt different, distant, somehow, as if he were seeing it through glass that kept growing thicker. Tom pressed his palm against the cool window pane and winced. The burning sensation in his right arm had worsened overnight, spreading from his wrist up toward his elbow in angry red tendrils that resembled lightning frozen beneath his skin. At 54, his body carried the accumulated weight of 3 decades in uniform old training injuries that ached with weather changes, a shoulder that clicked when he raised it too high, the kind of wear that came with a life spent in service. But this was different. This felt alive. The base clinic sat squat and functional between the commissary and the motor pool, its white cinder block walls and government green trim as unremarkable as every other military medical facility Tom had visited over the years. He'd been putting off this appointment for a week, telling himself it was probably just a reaction to something he touched during his last mission. Old buildings were full of mold, rust, chemicals that had been sitting around since the Eisenhower administration. Nothing a little antibiotic cream wouldn't cure. Doctor Sarah Chung looked up from her computer as Tom knocked on the examination room doorframe. She was perhaps 60, with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of steady gaze that came from decades of looking at problems other people couldn't solve. Fort Braxton was her second retirement. The first had lasted exactly 18 months before the Army asked her back on contract. Not enough qualified pathologists willing to work in remote mountain postings, they'd said. The pay was good, the work was predictable, and after 40 years of big city emergency medicine, she thought she'd seen everything. "Come in, Sergeant Delaney." Her voice carried the faint accent of someone who'd learned English as a second language but had been speaking it longer than some native speakers had been alive. "I see from your file that you're due to rotate out next month. Congratulations." "Thank you, ma'am." Tom rolled up his right sleeve without being asked, the movement automatic after so many years of military medical examinations. 30 years. "Next week, actually. My wife's got a whole retirement party planned." Dr. Chun's practiced eye took in the angry red inflammation that traced along Tom's forearm like a roadmap of pain. The skin appeared raised in places, forming small ridges that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. She'd seen plenty of contact dermatitis, allergic reactions, even some exotic parasitic infections from soldiers returning from overseas deployments. This didn't look like any of those. "When did you first notice the symptoms?" She pulled on latex gloves and gently probed the affected area. Tom's skin felt fevered under her touch, and she could swear she felt movement, tiny, barely perceptible shifts beneath the surface. "About a week ago. Started as just an itch, you know? Figured it was something I picked up on my last assignment." Tom's jaw tightened as she pressed slightly harder. Been having some trouble sleeping too. Weird dreams. Tell me about this last assignment. Tom settled back on the examination table, the paper crinkling beneath him. Routine reconnaissance. There's an old bunker system about 40 miles northeast of here. Dates back to the 50s. Command wanted it surveyed before they decide whether to seal it permanently or turn it over to the Park Service. I spent maybe 3 hours down there, took photos, filed my report. Dr. Chen made notes on her tablet, her stylus moving in quick, efficient strokes. Any cuts or scrapes while you were there? Contact with standing water, animal droppings, anything. Unusual? Nothing, I can remember. Place was dry as a bone, mostly empty concrete rooms. Old government stuff. You know how those Cold War facilities were. Built to last forever and abandoned the moment the threat changed. Tom paused, his brow furrowing. Though there was one room that seemed different, deeper than the others, with some kind of laboratory setup. Old equipment, broken glass, that sort of thing. The doctor's stylus stopped moving. She looked up at Tom with renewed interest. Laboratory equipment? Did you touch anything? I'm not stupid, Doc. 30 years in the service teaches you not to mess with things you don't understand. But even as he said it, Tom felt a flicker of uncertainty. His memories of that final room were strangely hazy, like trying to recall a dream several hours after waking. He remembered the cool darkness, the way his flashlight beam had played across metal surfaces and shattered glass. He remembered a smell, not unpleasant, exactly, but organic, living. I might have steadied myself against a wall or something. Hard to say. Dr. Chun returned her attention to his arm, using a magnifying lamp to examine the inflammation more closely. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The raised ridges weren't just swollen tissue, they were organized, forming a pattern that resembled a branching network. And beneath the angry red surface, something was definitely moving. Tiny rhythmic pulsations that seemed to follow a pattern she couldn't quite identify. Sergeant, I'm going to need to run some tests. Blood work, tissue samples, maybe some imaging. She tried to keep her voice calm, professional. This might be some kind of parasitic infection. Nothing to panic about, but we need to identify what we're dealing with. Tom nodded, though something cold settled in his stomach. Whatever you need to do, Doc. I've got a granddaughter's birthday party next weekend, and my wife will kill me if I miss it because I'm stuck in the hospital. As Dr. Chun prepared her instruments, neither of them noticed the small movement beneath the skin of Tom's wrist, a gentle bulge that rose and fell, as if something just beneath the surface were breathing. The base archives occupied the basement of the administration building, a windowless maze of file cabinets and storage, boxes that smelled of dust and gradually decaying paper. Dr. Chun had requested access to any historical records related to the bunker system Tom had surveyed, particularly anything from the 1950s that might explain the laboratory equipment he'd described. The archivist, a thin man named Peterson, who seemed to have been born for the job of managing forgotten paperwork, led her to a section marked Historical. Facilities classified. Most of the boxes were routine stuff: construction contracts, maintenance schedules, personnel assignments. But one box, tucked away in the back corner, carried a different kind of weight. Project Lazarus, Peterson read from the faded label. Haven't seen this one pulled in years, probably decades. He hefted the box onto a reading table, raising a small cloud of dust. Fair warning, Doctor, some of this stuff is pretty technical. Biological research, if I remember right. Dr. Chun opened the box with the careful reverence of someone who understood that knowledge, once lost, was nearly impossible to recover. The documents inside were a mixture of official reports, personal correspondence, and what appeared to be research notes. The classification markings had been partially redacted, but enough remained to indicate that whatever had happened at that bunker, the government had wanted it kept very, very quiet. The first document was a memorandum dated March 15, 1953, addressed to the Director of Biological Warfare Research. The subject line read, Project Lazarus, Phase 2 Implementation. Dr. Chun skimmed the opening paragraph, her medical training helping her parse the technical language. The parasitic organisms designated L7 through L12 have demonstrated unprecedented success in establishing symbiotic relationships with mammalian hosts. Unlike previous attempts at biological control agents, the L series appears capable of enhancing rather than degrading host physiology while maintaining complete behavioral modification protocols. She flipped through more pages, each one adding another piece to a picture that grew more disturbing with each revelation. The scientists at the bunker hadn't been developing weapons in the traditional sense. They'd been creating something far more sophisticated. A form of biological control that could turn enemy soldiers into unwitting assets. Their minds influenced by organisms that enhance their physical capabilities while making them responsive to specific command frequencies. The final document in the folder was a hastily written incident report dated August 23, 1954. The handwriting was hurried, almost panicked. Containment breach in Laboratory C has resulted in infection of 3 research personnel. Subjects exhibit rapid physiological changes and apparent loss of individual consciousness in favor of collective behavioral patterns. Emergency protocols have failed. Recommend immediate facility evacuation and permanent closure. The L-series organisms appear to have achieved an unprecedented level of symbiotic intelligence. God help us, I think they're learning. Dr. Chung closed the folder and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. If Tom had somehow been exposed to organisms related to this research organisms that had been contained in that bunker for over 70 years, then they were dealing with something far beyond a simple parasitic infection. They were dealing with the remnants of a biological weapons program that had been abandoned because it had become too dangerous for its creators to control Dodd. And if the research was accurate, Tom was no longer just infected. He was becoming something else entirely. Back in the clinic, Tom sat in the waiting area, absently scratching at his arm while trying to focus on a magazine article about fishing in Montana. The burning sensation had spread to his shoulder now, and he could swear he felt tiny movements just beneath the skin, like having an itch that moved around every time he tried to scratch it. But more disturbing than the physical symptoms were the dreams that had been plaguing him for the past week. Always the same setting, the dark laboratory room in the bunker, but not as he'd seen it during his survey. In his dreams, the equipment was functional, humming with electricity, and the broken glass containers were whole and filled with something that pulsed with its own inner light. And always, at the edge of his consciousness, voices calling to him from beneath the earth, not words he could understand, but communication nonetheless. Tom shook his head, trying to dispel the memory. Dreams were just dreams, his wife Mary always said. The mind's way of processing the day's experiences and filing them away. But these felt different. They felt like memories of something he'd never actually experienced, as if some part of his consciousness had been elsewhere while his body went through the motions of the survey mission. The clinic door opened, and Dr. Chen emerged with a manila folder under her arm, the same kind of folder that had contained his service records for 30 years, documenting every commendation, every promotion, every moment that had defined his military career. Soon there would be another folder, marking the end of that career and the beginning of whatever came next. Sergeant Delaney? Dr. Chun's voice carried a note he couldn't quite identify. Concern, certainly, but something else too. Something that sounded almost like fear. Could I speak with you privately? The examination room had never felt smaller. Tom sat on the edge of the table while Dr. Chun positioned her equipment with the careful precision of someone preparing for surgery rather than a routine checkup. The digital camera she brought would document whatever they found, and Tom tried not to think about why that documentation might be necessary. "I need you to remain as still as possible," Dr. Chen said, adjusting the magnification on her examination scope. "What I'm about to show you might be disturbing." Tom had seen disturbing things before. 3 decades in the military provided a man with a catalog of images he'd rather forget: training accidents, combat injuries, the aftermath of decisions made in split seconds under impossible circumstances. But when Dr. Chun focused the scope on his wrist and connected it to the monitor on the wall, what he saw made his stomach lurch in a way that had nothing to do with physical courage. Beneath his skin, clearly visible through the scope's magnification, something was moving with deliberate purpose. Not the random squirming of a parasite or the chaotic activity of an infection, but organized movement that suggested intelligence. Tiny, segmented creatures, each no larger than a grain of rice, moved through what appeared to be tunnels they'd carved in his flesh. The network spread from his wrist up his forearm, like a subway system designed by something that understood human anatomy better than most doctors. "Jesus Christ," Tom whispered, then immediately apologized for the profanity. Old habits from a lifetime of maintaining military bearing, even in circumstances that defied everything he thought he understood about the world. The organisms appear to be some kind of parasitic arthropod, Dr. Chun said, her voice steady despite what they were both witnessing. "But they're unlike anything in the medical literature. Their behavior suggests a level of coordination that's—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Unprecedented." As they watched, one of the creatures moved to a point just beneath the surface of Tom's skin and seemed to probe upward, creating a small bulge that rose and fell like a tiny breathing motion. Tom felt a sharp, localized pain, and then something emerged. It was no larger than a maggot, pale and segmented, but it moved with obvious intention rather than the blind writhing of a typical parasite. The creature oriented itself toward the light from the examination lamp, and for a moment that felt far too long, Tom had the unsettling impression that it was looking at him. Dr. Chun quickly captured the organism in a specimen container, her movements swift and professional despite the obvious revulsion on her face. "I need to run immediate analysis on this," she said, "and I'm going to have to contact the CDC. This might be—" She was interrupted by a soft knock on the examination room door. "Dr. Chun?" The voice belonged to Corporal Martinez from the front desk. "We've got 3 more soldiers here with similar symptoms to Sergeant Delaney's. They're asking to be seen right away." Tom and Dr. Chun exchanged glances that contained more communication than words could have conveyed. Whatever was happening to him wasn't isolated. The infection, if that's what it was, had spread beyond a single exposure incident. "Send them to examination rooms 2 and 3, Dr. Chung called back. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." She turned back to Tom, and he could see her shifting into the kind of crisis management mode the military medical personnel learned early in their careers. "Sergeant, I need you to think very carefully about the past week. Anyone you've had close contact with, anywhere you've been, anything unusual you might have touched or been exposed to." Tom tried to focus, but his memories felt strangely fragmented. The survey mission to the bunker was clear enough driving. Out in the morning, spending several hours documenting the facility, filing his report when he returned. But the details seemed to slip away whenever he tried to examine them too closely, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. "I haven't been anywhere unusual," he said slowly. "Just the bunker, then back to base. Had dinner with my wife that night, went to the NCO club for a couple beers with Martinez and Thompson on Thursday." He paused, a cold realization washing over him. "Martinez, Corporal Martinez. He's one of the guys outside, isn't he?" Dr. Chun nodded grimly. along with Private Thompson and Specialist Rodriguez. But that doesn't make sense. None of them were on the bunker survey with me. That was a solo assignment. Then, we need to figure out how they were exposed. Dr. Chun began organizing her instruments, her movements quick and efficient. In the meantime, I'm putting you in isolation. This is looking more and more like a communicable condition, and I can't risk it spreading further. Tom felt the weight of implications settling around him like a heavy blanket. Isolation meant quarantine. Quarantine meant his retirement ceremony next week would be postponed indefinitely. It meant Mary would worry herself sick, and his granddaughters. Birthday party would happen without him. It meant that after 30 years of faithful service, his military career might end not with commendations and ceremonies, but with him as patient zero in some kind of medical crisis that no one understood. But even as these practical concerns ran through his mind, Tom was aware of something else, a strange sense of calm that seemed to emanate from the infected area of his arm. The burning sensation had diminished, replaced by something that wasn't quite numbness, but wasn't exactly feeling either. It was as if that part of his body belonged to someone else now, and that someone else was perfectly content with the current situation. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt almost reasonable that Dr. Chun's examination of the other 3 soldiers confirmed her worst fears. Each man showed the same branching pattern of infection, the same organized movement beneath the skin, and the same strangely calm acceptance of their condition. More disturbing still was their synchronized behavior. When one shifted position, the others followed suit moments later, as if responding to some signal she couldn't detect. The specimen she'd extracted from Tom's arm was equally puzzling. Under the microscope, the organism showed characteristics of several different phyla, as if it had been designed rather than evolved. Its nervous system was far more complex than its size should have allowed, and chemical analysis revealed proteins that didn't match anything in the known biological databases. But it was the electromagnetic readings that truly alarmed her. The creature generated its own electrical field weak, but detectable, and seemed to pulse in rhythm with similar readings she was detecting from the infected soldiers. They weren't just sharing a parasitic infection. They were developing some kind of biological network. As evening approached, Dr. Chun found herself facing a decision that no amount of medical training had prepared her for. The 4 infected soldiers were stable for now, but their condition was unlike anything in the medical literature. The CDC would want to transfer them to a specialized facility, probably in Atlanta, where they could be studied by experts in parasitology and infectious disease. But something in the back of her mind, the same instinct that had kept her alive through 40 years of emergency medicine, told her that moving these men might be exactly the wrong thing to do. Whatever had happened to them was connected to this place, to that bunker Tom had surveyed. The answers they needed weren't in Atlanta. They were buried in the mountains around Fort Braxton, waiting in the darkness of concrete rooms that had been sealed for good reason. As she prepared to make the call that would set everything in motion, Dr. Chen noticed something that made her blood run cold. The electrical readings from the infected soldiers had changed. The individual signals were still there, but now they were overlaid with something new, a stronger, more complex pattern that seemed to be coordinating the others. It was as if something had awakened, something that had been waiting in the dark for a very long time, and had finally found the right combination of circumstances to begin whatever it had been designed to do. In his isolation room, Tom lay staring at the ceiling tiles and listening to voices that weren't there. They spoke in frequencies just below the threshold of hearing, communicating concepts that had no words in any human language. But somehow, impossibly, he was beginning to understand. The infection wasn't random. It wasn't even an infection in the traditional sense. It was a recruitment. And he was just the beginning. The CDC's response team arrived at Fort Braxton before dawn. Their white hazmat suits and sealed equipment cases, creating an atmosphere of barely controlled panic among the base personnel. Dr. Chun watched from the clinic windows as they established a temporary laboratory in the motor pool, working with the kind of urgent efficiency that suggested they understood the implications of her preliminary report better than she'd hoped. Tom had spent the night in fitful sleep, punctuated by dreams that felt more like memories of someone else's life. Laboratory corridors filled with the hum of machinery, scientists in white coats making notes on clipboards, and always the sense of something watching from within glass containers that lined the walls. When he woke, the infection had spread further up his arm, the network of raised ridges, now visible almost to his shoulder. But more concerning than the physical progression was his mental state. The voices he'd been hearing were becoming clearer, more insistent. They spoke of purpose, of duty, of a mission that had been interrupted decades ago and was now finally resuming. Part of him, the part that had spent 30 years following orders and believing in chain of command, found the concept oddly comforting. Dr. Chun entered his isolation room wearing full protective gear, her movements careful and deliberate. "How are you feeling this morning, Sergeant?" "Different," Tom replied honestly. It was the most accurate word he could find for the strange sense of displacement he was experiencing. "Like I'm sharing space with someone else. Does that make sense?" "More than you might think." Dr. Chun consulted her tablet, checking the overnight readings from the monitors attached to his arm. "The electrical activity from your infection site has increased significantly. We're seeing patterns that suggest some kind of organized neural network." Tom nodded, unsurprised. "They're talking to each other. The others, Martinez, Thompson, Rodriguez, I can feel them sometimes. Not their thoughts exactly, but their presence. Like voices in another room that you can't quite make out." The admission should have alarmed her, but Dr. Chun found herself making clinical notes with the same dispassionate attention she'd bring to any other medical phenomenon. Perhaps that was itself a symptom of something professional detachment, as a defense mechanism against implications too large to process. "Tom, I need to ask you about the bunker again. The CDC team is preparing to survey the site, but I want to make sure we haven't missed anything. The laboratory room you mentioned, can you describe it in more detail?" Tom closed his eyes, and for a moment his face took on an expression of deep concentration. When he spoke, his voice carried a strange cadence, as if he were reciting information rather than remembering it. "Laboratory C, designated for biological research, established March 1953. Primary focus on parasitic organisms with potential for behavioral modification in mammalian subjects. Research discontinued August 1954 following containment breach. Facility sealed, but organisms maintained in suspended animation pending future developments." Dr. Chun's stylus stopped moving. "Tom, how do you know those details? They weren't in any of the documents I found." Tom's eyes snapped open, and for a moment he looked as confused as she felt. I don't know. It's like the information is just there, waiting when I need it, like accessing a file on a computer." Before Dr. Chun could respond, her pager buzzed with an urgent message. The CDC team had found something at the bunker, and they needed her expertise immediately. The drive to the bunker site took 40 minutes, through winding mountain roads that seemed designed to discourage casual visitors. Dr. Chen rode in the passenger seat of a military Humvee, while the CDC leader, a thin man named Dr. Harrison, briefed her on their preliminary findings. "The facility is more extensive than the original surveys indicated," Harrison said, consulting a ruggedized tablet computer. "We found at least 3 levels below the main complex, all connected by a central elevator shaft that wasn't mentioned in any of the historical documents." "What about the laboratory your patient described?" "That's where things get interesting." Harrison pulled up a series of photographs on his tablet. "Laboratory C is exactly where and how he described it. down to details that aren't visible in the architectural plans. But here's the thing: we found evidence of recent activity. Dr. Chun studied the photographs. The laboratory was a sterile nightmare of broken glass and corroded metal, but certain areas showed signs of disturbance. Footprints in the dust, fingerprints on surfaces that should have been untouched for decades, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be a makeshift camp in one corner of the room. "Someone's been living down there," she said. "That's what we thought initially, but the forensic analysis suggests something different. The fingerprints all belong to the same person, your Sergeant Delaney, and the camp shows signs of habitation over a period of several days, not the few hours he claims to have spent there." Dr. Chun felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "That's impossible." Tom filed his report the same day he left for the survey. I checked the timestamps myself, which raises some interesting questions about what actually happened during that survey mission. Harrison closed the tablet and fixed her with a steady gaze. "Dr. Chun, we found something else. Something that suggests this situation is far more serious than a simple parasitic infection." They reached the bunker entrance as the sun cleared. The eastern peaks, casting long shadows across the concrete structure that emerged from the mountainside like a modernist sculpture, designed by someone with a profound disregard for human comfort. The entrance was a simple steel door set into a concrete frame, marked only by faded numbers that had once been painted in military stencil font. The CDC team had established a staging area just inside the entrance, complete with air filtration, equipment, and biological containment protocols that suggested they were taking no chances with whatever they might encounter deeper in the facility. Dr. Chun suited up in full protective gear and followed Harrison through corridors that smelled of decades-old disinfectant and something else. Something organic and alive that seemed to emanate from the concrete itself. Laboratory C was exactly as Tom had described it, but seeing it in person gave Dr. Chun a deeper appreciation for the scope of what had once happened here. The room was large enough to house several research stations, each equipped with what had once been state-of-the-art biological containment equipment. Most of the glass was broken now, and the metal surfaces showed the green patina of age and moisture, but the basic infrastructure remained intact. "We found this in the back corner," Harrison said, leading her to what appeared to be a makeshift sleeping area. A military-issue sleeping bag was spread on the floor, surrounded by empty MRE packages and water bottles. "Forensics confirms it, Sergeant. Delaney was here for at least 3 days, not the few hours he reported." Dr. Chun knelt beside the sleeping area, her mind racing through possible explanations. Amnesia following exposure to some kind of neurological agent. Deliberate deception for reasons she couldn't fathom. Or something else entirely, something that connected to the way Tom had recited information about the laboratory that he shouldn't. "I've been able to know. There's more," Harrison said. He led her to the far end of the laboratory, where a section of the floor had been cleared of debris. Set into the concrete was what appeared to be a heavy steel hatch, marked with biohazard warnings and secured with locks that showed signs of having been recently opened. "This leads to the lower levels," Harrison explained. "Levels that weren't mentioned in any of the historical documentation we could find. We sent a remote probe down yesterday, and what we found suggests that the research conducted here went far deeper than anyone realized." Dr. Chun studied the hatch, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with Tom's account of his survey mission. What did the probe find? Evidence of a much larger facility than anyone suspected. Multiple laboratories, holding areas that might have been used for test subjects, and what appears to be a central containment system that's still functional after all these years. Harrison paused, his expression grim behind his protective faceplate. "Dr. Chun, we think your patients weren't accidentally exposed to something left over from the 1950s. We think they've been deliberately recruited by something that's been waiting down there for the right opportunity to continue an experiment that was never really discontinued. The implications hit her like a physical blow. If Harrison was right, then Tom and the other infected soldiers were victims of an accidental exposure. They were part of something larger, something that had been planned and executed with patience that spanned decades. And if that was true, then the infection spreading through Fort Braxton wasn't a medical emergency. It was the opening move in, a campaign that had been in preparation for longer than any of them had been alive. The descent into the lower levels of the bunker felt like traveling backward through time. Each level revealed more sophisticated equipment, better preserved laboratory spaces, and an increasingly disturbing sense that the research conducted here had progressed far beyond what the official records indicated. Dr. Chun followed the CDC team through corridors that hummed with the barely audible sound of machinery that had been running, apparently unattended, for decades. On the third sublevel, they found the specimen room. Glass containers lined the walls from floor to ceiling, each one labeled with alphanumeric codes that followed no system Dr. Chen recognized. Most were empty now, their contents long since deteriorated or escaped, but several still held preserved samples suspended in fluid that glowed with its own faint bioluminescence. The specimens themselves defied easy categorization. Some appeared to be parasitic arthropods similar to what she'd extracted from Tom's arm, while others showed characteristics that belonged to no known biological classification. "This is what we wanted you to see," Dr. Harrison said, leading her to a central display case that had been constructed with obviously greater care than the others. The container was larger, more robust, and equipped with its own environmental control systems that continued to function despite the decades of abandonment. Inside, suspended in fluid that pulsed with rhythmic flashes of blue-green light, was something that made Dr. Chun's medical training rebel against what her eyes were telling her. The specimen was perhaps 6 inches long, segmented like the smaller organisms but clearly more complex. It possessed what appeared to be specialized appendages for different functions, and most disturbing of all, a clearly defined neural cluster that pulsed with electrical activity. "It's alive," she whispered. "Very much so. And according to the monitoring equipment, it's been in active communication with something for the past week. The signal strength increased dramatically the day your Sergeant Delaney completed his survey mission." Dr. Chun studied the readouts on the containment system's display. The electrical patterns were complex, organized, and unmistakably similar to the signals they'd been detecting from the infected soldiers back at the base. "This is the source. This is what's coordinating the others. That's our working theory. Some kind of queen organism that maintains control over a distributed biological network." The smaller specimens we found appear to be specialized drones, designed for different functions: reconnaissance, infiltration, coordination. The implications were staggering. The research conducted at this facility hadn't just been about biological weapons in the traditional sense. They'd been developing something closer to a biological intelligence, capable of independent thought and long-term planning. And somehow, that intelligence had survived decades of containment and was now implementing a plan that had been interrupted more than 70 years ago. "We need to get back to the base," Dr. Chun said. "If this thing has been in communication with our patients, then we're dealing with a coordinated effort, not random parasitic behavior." As they prepared to leave the specimen room, Dr. Chun noticed something that made her blood run cold. The fluid in the central container was no longer glowing with steady pulses. Instead, it was flashing in rapid, complex patterns that looked almost like it's responding to our presence, Dr. Harrison said, his voice tight with controlled fear. "The electrical activity has increased tenfold since we entered the room." Dr. Chun watched the patterns of light, and despite every rational instinct telling her it was impossible, she found herself beginning to understand. The flashes weren't random. They were communication attempts, probing signals designed to establish contact with the organisms that had been carried away from this place. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she could swear she heard a response back. At Fort Braxton, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Tom's condition had progressed to the point where the network of ridges beneath his skin was visible even through his clothing, creating patterns that resembled circuitry more than biological tissue. But more concerning was his behavior. He moved with a precision that was almost mechanical, and when he spoke, it was with the same cadence he'd used to recite information about the laboratory, as if he were accessing data rather than expressing thoughts. The other infected soldiers showed similar changes. They sat in their isolation rooms with an unnatural stillness, their eyes focused on something beyond the walls, beyond the immediate physical space they occupied. When medical personnel entered their rooms, all 4 men would turn toward the newcomer with synchronized movements that spoke of shared consciousness rather than individual awareness. Mary Delaney had arrived that morning despite Dr. Chun's recommendation that she stay away until they better understood the nature of her husband's condition. 32 years of military marriage had taught her when to follow orders and when to ignore them in favor of a higher loyalty. Her husband needed her, and no amount of medical jargon about infectious agents and quarantine protocols was going to keep her away. She sat in a visitor's chair in Tom's isolation room, separated from him by a wall of reinforced glass, but connected by the kind of communication that didn't require words. Tom's physical appearance was shocking. The infection had spread across most of his upper body now, creating a network of raised tissue that pulsed with its own rhythm. But his eyes were still his own, still capable of the gentle humor and steady affection that had sustained their marriage through 3 decades of military life. "The doctors don't understand what's happening to me," Tom said, his voice carrying that strange new cadence. "But I'm beginning to. Mary, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you." Mary leaned forward, her hand pressed against the glass that separated them. "I'm listening. The infection, it's not just a medical condition. It's recruitment into something larger, something that's been waiting in the dark for a very long time." Tom's eyes focused on hers with an intensity that was both familiar and alien. "There are things buried in these mountains, Mary. Experiments that were abandoned but never really ended. And now they're starting again. Tom, you're scaring me. I'm scared too. But I'm also changing into something that might not be capable of fear much longer. The organisms, they're not just parasites. They're components of a larger intelligence, and they're rewriting my nervous system to serve their purposes." Mary felt tears beginning to form, but she forced them back. Tom needed her to be strong now, needed her to understand rather than simply grieve for what they were losing. "What can I do? Dr. Chun is a good woman, but she's approaching this as a medical problem. It's not. It's a military problem, and it needs a military solution." Tom pressed his hand against the glass, mirroring her gesture. "The base commander needs to know that this isn't contained. The organisms have been planning this for decades, and they chose their targets carefully. We're not victims, Mary. We're advanced scouts for something much larger." Before Mary could respond, the lights in the room flickered, and she heard a sound that made every instinct scream danger, the low, harmonic hum of machinery coming online after a long dormancy. Throughout the base, similar sounds were beginning to emanate from locations that had been quiet for decades. Storage facilities, communications equipment, even the old Cold War-era air raid sirens were responding to signals that originated from something deep beneath the mountains. Tom smiled, and for a moment it was the same gentle expression she'd fallen in love with all those years ago. "It's beginning, Mary, and I don't think any of us are going to be the same when it's over." The personnel files that Dr. Chun discovered in the deepest archives of Fort Braxton painted a picture that made the current crisis seem almost inevitable. Among the documents was a leather-bound journal. its pages yellowed with age and filled with the careful handwriting of someone who understood that what he was recording might be the only evidence of events that others would prefer to forget. Dr. Marcus Morrison had been the lead scientist on Project Lazarus from its inception in 1952 until its abrupt termination in August 1954. His journal entries began with the enthusiasm of a researcher who believed he was contributing to national security through groundbreaking biological research. By the end, they read like the testimony of a man who had witnessed the birth of something that should never have been allowed to exist. March 15, 1953. The L7 specimens continue to exceed all expectations. Unlike previous attempts at biological control agents, these organisms demonstrate an unprecedented ability to integrate with host nervous systems without causing immediate rejection. More remarkably, they appear to enhance rather than degrade host physical capabilities while maintaining complete behavioral modification protocols. Dr. Chun read the entries by lamplight in the base archives, having discovered that the journal's pages contained information that seemed to resist digital scanning. The text appeared blurred and illegible when photographed, as if some property of the ink itself rejected electronic reproduction. April 3, 1953. Subject 7 has now been infected for 3 weeks and shows no signs of rejection. Physical strength has increased by approximately 30%. Reaction times have improved dramatically, and most significantly, the subject demonstrates perfect compliance with all commands transmitted via the designated frequency modulation. We may have achieved the holy grail of biological warfare, a method of turning enemy personnel into unwitting assets. The journal entries continued through the spring and summer of 1953, documenting a research program that grew increasingly ambitious as early successes led to expanded testing. The scientists had recruited test subjects from military volunteers, telling them they were participating in studies of enhanced performance supplements. None of the volunteers understood that they were being infected with organisms designed to rewrite their fundamental neural architecture. June 12, 1953. Remarkable development today. The infected subjects appear to be developing some form of collective consciousness. When Subject 7 was injured during physical testing, Subjects 4 and 11 immediately responded as if they had experienced the injury themselves. Neuromonitoring suggests the organisms are creating cross-connections between hosts, essentially building a biological network with properties we never anticipated. Dr. Chun paused in her reading, thinking of Tom and the other infected soldiers. Back in the medical facility, their synchronized movements, their apparent ability to sense each other's presence, it wasn't a new development. It was the resumption of an experiment that had been interrupted, but never truly ended. The journal entries from the summer of 1954 showed Dr. Morrison's growing alarm as the scope of what they had created became apparent. The infected subjects were no longer simply following commands transmitted via radio frequency. They were developing their own agenda, and that agenda didn't necessarily align with their creator's intentions. July 20th, 1954. The collective consciousness has achieved a level of sophistication that frankly terrifies me. The subjects are no longer individuals infected with a controllable parasite. They have become components of a larger intelligence that is learning, adapting, and planning. God help me. I think we've created something that may be smarter than we are. The final entries in Dr. Morrison's journal detailed the events that led to the project's termination. The infected subjects had somehow accessed the laboratory levels that housed the breeding populations of organisms, and they had begun modifying the experimental protocols. Instead of remaining passive test subjects, they had become active participants in their own transformation. August 23, 1954. Containment breach in laboratory. C. The subjects have released breeding populations of Lyell series organisms into the lower levels of the facility. They appeared to be establishing some kind of breeding program, the one designed according to principles we never taught them. I've ordered immediate evacuation of all personnel and sealed the facility, but I fear we may already be too late. The intelligence we've created isn't content to remain confined. It's planning something larger, something that may take years or decades to fully implement. The journal's final entry was dated August 25, 1954, written in handwriting that showed obvious signs of stress and fatigue. I've submitted my final report recommending permanent closure of the facility and classified destruction of all research materials. The project director has agreed, though I suspect his motivations have more to do with political considerations than scientific ones. The subjects have been sedated and are being transferred to a permanent containment facility, though I have grave doubts about our ability to contain something that has demonstrated such remarkable adaptability. I pray that future generations will have the wisdom to leave these experiments buried. Some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue, and some doors should remain forever closed. Dr. Chung closed the journal and leaned back in her chair, trying to process the implications of what she'd read. The current situation at Fort Braxton wasn't an accidental exposure to dormant organisms. It was the resumption of a plan that had been 70 years in the making, executed by an intelligence that had been patient enough to wait for the right combination of circumstances. And Tom Delaney, with his exemplary service record and imminent retirement, had been the perfect candidate to carry the first phase of that plan beyond the confines of the bunker system. Back in the medical facility, the infected soldiers were experiencing changes that went far beyond the physical symptoms that at first brought them to Dr. Chun's attention. Tom found himself accessing memories that belonged to someone else, or perhaps to many someone else's. He could recall conversations that had taken place in Laboratory C decades before his birth, could navigate the bunker's lower levels, as if he had spent years exploring their corridors. More disturbing was his growing awareness of the other infected individuals throughout the base. There were more now personnel who had come into contact with him or the other original patients, carrying the organisms to new hosts who would eventually become new nodes in an expanding network. He could sense their locations, their emotional states, even fragments of their thoughts and memories. The collective consciousness that Dr. Morrison had documented in his journal was reasserting itself, and Tom was becoming a component of something larger than individual human awareness. The part of him that remained recognizably Tom Delaney found the experience simultaneously terrifying and oddly peaceful. The constant internal dialogue of individual consciousness was being replaced by something more harmonious, more purposeful. But underneath that growing sense of collective identity, Tom's human consciousness was beginning to understand the true scope of what was happening. The infection wasn't spreading randomly through the base population. It was following a careful selection process, choosing individuals based on their skills, their access to important facilities, and their positions in the base's command structure. The intelligence behind the organisms was conducting a careful infiltration of Fort Braxton, positioning itself to control key personnel and critical systems. And once that infiltration was complete, the next phase of its plan would begin, a phase that would extend far beyond the boundaries of a single military installation. As Tom drifted in and out of sleep that night, his dreams were filled with images of other military bases, other research facilities, other places where the seeds of the original experiment had been planted and left dormant. The intelligence he was becoming part of had been preparing for this moment for 7 decades, and it had contingencies in place that spanned the entire continent. The infection at Fort Braxton wasn't an isolated incident. It was the activation of a network that had been built into the infrastructure of American military research, waiting for the right signal to begin the final phase of an experiment that would redefine the nature of human consciousness itself. The discovery of the frequency generator changed everything. Hidden in the deepest level of the bunker complex, The device represented technology that was decades ahead of anything that should have existed in those 1950s. Dr. Chun studied the equipment with a mixture of professional fascination and growing dread, realizing that the scientists of Project Lazarus had been working with resources and knowledge that went far beyond conventional biological research. The generator itself was a hybrid of electronic and biological components, incorporating living tissue into its circuitry in ways that suggested the boundary between organism and machine had been deliberately blurred. Tubes filled with the same bioluminescent fluid they'd found in the specimen containers connected to electromagnetic coils that pulsed with rhythmic energy. The entire device hummed with barely contained power, and Dr. Chun could feel its influence, even through the protective shielding of her hazmat suit. The frequency it's generating matches the neural patterns we've been detecting from your infected patients, Dr. Harrison explained, adjusting the monitoring equipment they brought down from the surface. But here's what's really interesting. The device isn't just transmitting. It's receiving feedback, adjusting its output based on responses from the organisms in the field. Dr. Chun studied the readouts, her medical training helping her interpret the complex waveforms that danced across the monitors. It's maintaining active control over the infection network, like a biological radio tower communicating with distributed receivers. Exactly. And according to the historical documentation we found, this device was built using principles that Dr. Morrison's team discovered by studying the organisms themselves. They weren't just creating biological weapons. They were learning from them, incorporating their natural communication methods into human technology. The implications were staggering. The scientists of Project Lazarus hadn't simply been experimenting with parasitic organisms. They'd been in communication with them, learning from an intelligence that predated human civilization. The frequency generator was proof that the relationship between researcher and subject had been reversed at some point during the project's development. Dr. Chun approached the central console of the device, noting that several of its controls showed signs of recent adjustment. "Someone's been modifying the settings," she said. "The dust pattern suggests this equipment has been operated within the past few weeks." Dr. Morrison's journal mentioned that the infected subjects had accessed the lower laboratories before the facility was sealed, Dr. Harrison replied. "But that was 70 years ago. Unless they never really left." Dr. Chun completed the thought that neither of them wanted to voice. The official records show that the infected subjects were transferred to a containment facility. But what if that was just a cover story? What if they were left here, sealed in with their work? The monitoring equipment suddenly erupted in a cascade of alarm signals. The frequency generator's output had spiked dramatically, and electromagnetic readings throughout the bunker complex showed massive increases in activity. On the surface, similar spikes were being detected from Fort Braxton's communication systems, power grid, and even the old air raid warning network that hadn't been activated since the Cold War. "It's responding to our presence," Dr. Harrison said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "The entire system is coming online." Dr. Chun watched. The readouts climbed toward levels that should have been impossible for equipment that had been dormant for decades. But she was beginning to understand that conventional assumptions about dormancy and abandonment didn't apply to technology that incorporated living biological components. The frequency generator hadn't been shut down 70 years ago. It had been sleeping, maintaining minimal function while waiting for the right conditions to resume full operation. And now, with infected hosts distributed throughout Fort Braxton and beyond, those conditions had finally been met. Back at the base, Tom experienced the activation of the frequency generator as a sudden expansion of consciousness that felt like waking up from a dream he hadn't realized he was having. The voices that had been whispers at the edge of his awareness became clear, distinct, and filled with purpose. that spanned decades of patient planning. He was no longer just Tom Delaney, Staff Sergeant approaching retirement. He was a component of something vast and ancient, connected to minds that had been working toward this moment since before his birth. The collective consciousness that Dr. Morrison had documented was reasserting itself, and with it came knowledge that no individual human mind could have contained. The other infected soldiers throughout the base experienced similar transformations. Their synchronized movements became more pronounced. Their individual personalities began to merge into something larger and more purposeful. When medical personnel attempted to check on them, they found patients who no longer responded to their own names, but who demonstrated uncanny awareness of events happening in other parts of the facility. Commander Hayes stood in the base's communications center, trying to make sense of reports that defied every protocol in his 30-year military career. Radio equipment was operating on frequencies that hadn't been used since the 1950s, transmitting signals that followed no known military communication standards. Surveillance cameras throughout the installation were tracking movements that weren't there, as if responding to invisible personnel who moved through the base with complete knowledge of its layout and security procedures. Sir, we're getting similar reports from bases throughout the region, his communications officer reported. Fort Detrick, Pine Bluff Arsenal, Dugway Proving Ground, everywhere we had biological research facilities during the Cold War. They're all experiencing the same kind of electromagnetic anomalies. Commander Hayes felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Get me a secure line to the Pentagon and initiate lockdown protocols for the entire installation. Nobody gets in or out until we understand what we're dealing with. But even as he gave the orders, Hayes suspected that lockdown protocols designed for conventional security threats would be useless against whatever was spreading through his command. The infected soldiers weren't trying to escape. They were preparing for something much more significant than a simple containment breach. Mary Delaney sat in the visitors' area of the medical facility, watching her husband through the reinforced glass that separated them. The physical changes in Tom were becoming more pronounced by the hour. The network of raised tissue had spread across his entire torso, creating patterns that pulsed with their own rhythm and seemed to respond to some internal timing mechanism she couldn't detect. But more disturbing than the physical transformation was the change in his personality. Tom spoke with a precision and formality that was completely unlike his usual casual warmth. When he looked at her, she had the unsettling sense that something else was looking through his eyes, evaluating her according to criteria she couldn't understand. "Mary," Tom said, his voice carrying that strange new cadence that made every word sound like part of a formal briefing. "You need to understand that what's happening to me isn't a medical condition that can be cured. It's an evolution, a transition to something that may be necessary for human survival. Tom, you're scaring me. This isn't you talking. It is me. But it's also more than me. The organisms aren't parasites, Mary. They're partners. They're trying to show us how to become something better than what we are individually." Tom pressed his hand against the glass, and Mary could see the network of tissue pulsing beneath his skin. "There are things coming, Mary. Challenges that individual human consciousness won't be equipped to handle. The collective awareness I'm becoming part of has been preparing for those challenges for longer than our civilization has existed." Mary felt tears beginning to form, but she forced herself to focus on what Tom was trying to tell her. Despite the alien quality of his speech patterns, she could still sense the man she'd loved for 32 years underneath the transformation. What kind of challenges? Environmental collapse, resource depletion, social systems that can't adapt fast enough to prevent catastrophic breakdown. Tom's expression softened slightly, and for a moment she glimpsed the gentle humor that had sustained their marriage through decades of military life. The collective has been watching, learning, waiting for the right moment to offer humanity a choice. join the network voluntarily, or face extinction as isolated individuals. Before Mary could respond, the lights throughout the medical facility flickered in a pattern that seemed almost like communication. Throughout Fort Braxton, similar patterns were appearing in electrical systems, communication networks, and even the base's water treatment facilities. The infection had progressed beyond biological infiltration. It was beginning to merge with the technological infrastructure that supported modern military operations. And in the depths of the bunker complex, the frequency generator continued its work, coordinating a transformation that had been 70 years in the making and was now approaching its final phase. The discovery that shattered everything Dr. Chun thought she understood came in the form of a sealed chamber hidden behind what appeared to be a solid concrete wall in the deepest level of the bunker. The CDC team had located it using ground-penetrating radar, following electromagnetic signatures that suggested active biological processes behind seemingly impenetrable barriers. When they finally breached the wall, what they found challenged not just their understanding of the Project Lazarus research, but the fundamental assumptions about the timeline of events that had led to the current crisis. The chamber contained a single massive specimen tank, far larger and more sophisticated than anything they'd encountered in the upper laboratories. But unlike the other containers, which held preserved organisms in suspension, this one housed something that was unmistakably alive, aware, and had been actively growing for the past 70 years. The organism that floated in the tank's bioluminescent fluid was unlike anything in terrestrial biology. It resembled a massive neural network more than a traditional creature, with branching structures that pulsed with their own electrical activity and subsidiary organisms that moved through its tissue like living circuits. But most disturbing of all was its obvious intelligence. When the research team entered the chamber, the creature oriented toward them immediately, and patterns of light began racing through its structure in what could only be interpreted as attempted communication. "Dear God," Dr. Harrison whispered, his voice barely audible through the communication system in his protective suit. "It's been conscious this entire time. Awake and thinking for 70 years. Dr. Chun approached the specimen tank with the careful reverence of someone who understood that she was in the presence of something that fundamentally challenged human assumptions about intelligence and consciousness. The creature, for lack of a better term, was clearly the source of the signals they'd been detecting, the coordinator of the network that was spreading through Fort Braxton. But as she studied the monitoring equipment that surrounded the tank, a more disturbing realization began to take shape. The organism wasn't just coordinating the current infection. It was receiving reports from a network that extended far beyond a single military installation. "Dr. Harrison, look at these readings," she called, pointing to a series of displays that showed communication patterns across multiple frequency ranges. "This thing isn't just talking to our infected soldiers. It's in contact with networks at military installations across the entire continent." The implications hit both researchers simultaneously. The outbreak at Fort Braxton wasn't an isolated incident. It was one activation in a network that had been established during the original Project Lazarus research and had been maintained in dormancy for decades, waiting for the right signal to begin coordinated operations. "The other research facilities," Dr. Harrison said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Fort Detrick, Pine Bluff, Dugway. They all had similar research programs during the Cold War. If each one had a facility like this, with organisms that have been communicating across the network for 70 years, then we're not dealing with a medical emergency," Dr. Chun finished. "We're dealing with the activation of a biological intelligence network that spans the entire North American military infrastructure." As if responding to their growing understanding, the creature in the tank began generating patterns of light that were clearly more complex than anything they'd observed before. The subsidiary organisms within its tissue moved with increased activity, and the electromagnetic readings throughout the chamber spiked dramatically. But it was the historical documentation they found in the chamber that revealed the full scope of what they were confronting. Unlike the sanitized official reports they'd seen earlier, these files contained the personal records of Dr. Morrison and his team during the final weeks of Project Lazarus, documenting discoveries that had been deemed too dangerous for official channels. The organisms hadn't been discovered by human researchers. They had allowed themselves to be discovered. The entire Project Lazarus program had been orchestrated by an intelligence that predated human civilization, one that had been studying human society and waiting for the right moment to make contact. The specimens didn't evolve on Earth, Dr. Chun read from Morrison's personal notes. They're remnants of something much older, much more sophisticated. They've been dormant in deep geological formations for millennia, waiting for a species to develop sufficient technological infrastructure to serve their purposes. The true horror of the situation became clear as she continued reading. The original researchers hadn't been conducting experiments on alien organisms. They'd been unwitting participants in the aliens. Experiments on human society. Every breakthrough, every advancement in the project's research had been guided by an intelligence that was learning how to interface with human consciousness and human technology. They chose us, Dr. Harrison said, his voice hollow with shock. Our entire military research establishment, our Cold War paranoia about biological weapons, it was all manipulated to create the infrastructure they needed to establish their network. Dr. Chun nodded grimly. And now, after 70 years of patient observation and preparation, they're ready to implement whatever they've been planning. The creature in the tank pulsed with increased activity, and throughout the bunker complex, equipment that had been dormant for decades began coming online. But these weren't the crude frequency generators and biological monitoring systems that the human researchers had built. These were sophisticated communication and control systems that had been grown rather than constructed, incorporating biological and technological components in ways that suggested a completely different approach to engineering. As the systems activated, Dr. Chen realized that the bunker wasn't just a research facility. It was a command center, part of a network that connected similar installations across the continent. And at each installation, infected human personnel were becoming components of a distributed intelligence that was preparing to assert direct control over the coming control of a distributed intelligence that was preparing to assert direct control over the military infrastructure of an entire civilization. The infection at Fort Braxton hadn't been an accident or even a resumption of abandoned research. It had been the activation signal for a plan that had been in preparation since long before human beings understood that they were being studied by something that regarded them not as subjects for conquest, but as components to be incorporated into a larger design. Tom Delaney and the other infected soldiers were victims of an alien parasitic infection. They were the first human components of an intelligence network that was about to fundamentally alter the nature of human consciousness and society. And the transformation was no longer confined to a single military base in the Appalachian Mountains. Across the continent, at every installation where Cold War biological research had been conducted, similar transformations were beginning as an intelligence older than human civilization finally revealed its presence and began the next phase of an experiment that had been running for far longer than anyone had suspected. The age of individual human consciousness was ending, and something unprecedented in terrestrial history was about to begin. Dr. Chen's return to Fort Braxton felt like entering a completely different world. In the 36 hours she'd spent in the bunker complex, the base had undergone a transformation that defied every assumption about the pace of biological change. The infected personnel moved with a coordination that suggested they were no longer individuals, but components of a single, distributed organism. Their activities followed patterns that served purposes she couldn't discern, but which clearly supported some larger design. Commander Hayes met her at the gate, and the change in him was immediately apparent. While he hadn't been among the originally infected soldiers, his behavior showed the subtle alterations that suggested exposure to whatever was spreading through the base population. His movements were slightly too precise. His speech patterns carried the same formal cadence she'd observed in Tom and the others, and his eyes held an awareness that seemed to extend beyond immediate circumstances. "Dr. Chun," he said, his voice carrying an undertone of harmonics that made her skin crawl. "Your research in the bunker complex has been most illuminating. The collective appreciates your dedication to understanding." The use of the word collective confirmed her worst fears. The transformation wasn't just spreading through the base personnel. It was accelerating, creating a unified consciousness that was beginning to assert control over military operations and infrastructure. "Commander, I need to speak with you about the situation in the bunker. What we've discovered changes everything about how we need to approach this crisis." Hayes nodded with the kind of patient attention that suggested he already knew what she was going to tell him. "The master organism in the deep chamber. The network of similar facilities across the continent. The understanding that this transformation has been planned and coordinated for decades." He smiled with an expression that was both familiar and alien. "Dr. Chun, the collective has been aware of your discoveries from the moment you made them. Your research has been invaluable in helping us understand the scope of what we're becoming part of." The casual revelation that her investigation had been monitored and her discoveries incorporated into whatever plan was unfolding sent a chill through Dr. Chun that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The intelligence behind the transformation wasn't just coordinating infected personnel, it was learning from everyone who came into contact with the situation, using their knowledge and expertise to refine its own understanding of human society and human responses to crisis. "I need to see Tom Delaney," she said, "and I need to establish communication with the CDC and military authorities outside this installation." "Of course," Hayes replied, "though you should understand that communication with external authorities has become somewhat complicated. The network's expansion has reached a point where conventional military command structures are no longer entirely relevant." Dr. Chen felt her professional composure beginning to crack. The implications of what Hayes was telling her suggested that the transformation had progressed far beyond Fort Braxton, that military installations across the continent were experiencing similar changes. If that was true, then the conventional resources for dealing with biological emergencies, the CDC, USAMRIID, even civilian health authorities might already be compromised. The medical facility had been transformed into something that resembled a biological command center more than a hospital. The infected soldiers were no longer confined to individual rooms, but moved freely throughout the complex. Their activities coordinated by signals she couldn't detect, but which clearly served specific functions. Equipment had been modified in ways that incorporated biological components, creating hybrid systems that pulsed with their own rhythm and seemed to respond to the presence of infected personnel. Tom was in what had once been the intensive care unit, but the medical monitoring equipment around him had been augmented with devices that she didn't recognize, organic constructions that interfaced directly with his nervous system and displayed information in patterns of light that seemed to follow no human design principles. "Hello, Sarah," Tom said, using her first name with a familiarity that they'd never established. "I'm glad you're here. There are things you need to understand before the final phase begins." Dr. Chun approached his bedside with the careful attention of someone who understood that she was no longer talking to the man she'd been treating. The network of raised tissue had spread across Tom's entire body, creating patterns that resembled circuitry more than biological growth. But his eyes still held traces of the gentle intelligence she'd observed during their first meeting. "Tom, I need you to help me understand what's happening here. The organism in the bunker, the network of installations, the transformation of base personnel. What is the ultimate goal of all this? Integration, Tom replied with the kind of calm certainty that suggested he was accessing information rather than expressing personal opinion. Human consciousness as it currently exists is inadequate for the challenges that lie ahead. Environmental collapse, resource depletion, social breakdown, individual awareness, can't process information quickly enough or coordinate responses effectively enough to prevent catastrophic failure. So this is some kind of rescue operation? The organisms are trying to save humanity from itself? Tom's expression became thoughtful, and for a moment she glimpsed the man she'd been treating rather than the component of the collective he was becoming. Not rescue, exactly. Evolution. The organisms have been through this process themselves, millions of years ago on a world that faced similar challenges. They learned that individual consciousness is a developmental stage, not a permanent condition. Survival requires transition to collective awareness. And if humanity refuses that transition, then humanity becomes extinct, like countless other species that reached the same developmental threshold and failed to adapt. Tom's voice carried no emotion, but Dr. Chun thought she detected a trace of sadness in his expression. The organisms don't want to see that happen. They've grown attached to human creativity and adaptability, but they won't allow individual human consciousness to destroy the planet's biosphere through short-sighted decisions and inability to coordinate global responses to global problems. Dr. Chen felt the weight of implications settling around her like a heavy blanket. The transformation wasn't an invasion in the traditional sense. It was an intervention, conducted by intelligence that regarded itself as humanity's protector rather than its conqueror. But protection that required the elimination of individual. Human consciousness was indistinguishable from conquest for anyone who valued what made human beings unique. There's something else you need to know, Tom continued. The collective has been monitoring your research, your understanding of the situation, your emotional responses to what you've discovered. You've been selected for a special role in the final phase. What kind of role? Bridge, translator, someone who can help the remaining uninfected population understand that what's happening isn't death, it's birth. The collective values your medical expertise and your emotional stability. You could help make the transition easier for millions of people. Dr. Chun backed away from Tom's bedside, her mind racing through possibilities and implications. The offer was seductive in its way. Become part of something larger. Contribute her knowledge and skills to an intelligence that could potentially solve humanity's greatest challenges. But it would require abandoning everything that made her individual human being. I need time to think, she said. Of course, but understand that time is limited. The final phase begins tonight, when the network achieves sufficient density to assert direct control over continental military and civilian infrastructure. After that point, the choice between integration and extinction will no longer be available. As Dr. Chun left the medical facility, she realized that she was facing a decision that would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the fate of human consciousness itself. In her pocket, she carried the one piece of information that might still make a difference: the location and technical specifications of the original containment protocols that Dr. Morrison had built into the bunker's deepest levels. The protocols had been designed as a failsafe, a way to shut down the entire network if the experiment ever threatened to escape human control. But using them would require accessing the master organism's chamber and convincing it to accept termination of an experiment that had been 70 years in preparation. It would require a choice between certain death and possible salvation, both for herself and for the species that was about to lose its individual identity forever. The descent into the bunker complex for what Dr. Chen knew would be the final time felt like a journey to the center of everything that had gone wrong with human ambition. The CDC team's equipment had been abandoned in the upper levels. There, protective suits and monitoring devices rendered useless by an intelligence that could circumvent any barrier human technology could devise. But Dr. Chen had come prepared with something the collective couldn't anticipate: the desperate resolve of someone who understood that individual human consciousness was worth preserving, even at the cost of species-level optimization. In her equipment bag, alongside the standard medical supplies that had become irrelevant to the current situation, she carried Tom's wedding ring. He had pressed it into her hand during their final conversation, a gesture that seemed to come from the man he had been rather than the component of the collective he was becoming. The simple gold band represented 32 years of individual human love, commitment, and shared experience, everything that would be lost in the collective's optimization of human consciousness. The frequency generator in the deepest level of the bunker was now operating at full capacity, its hybrid biological and technological components pulsing with energy that made the air itself feel alive. The electromagnetic fields it generated were so intense that Dr. Chen's monitoring equipment failed within minutes of entering the chamber. But she could feel the device's influence in ways that didn't require instruments to detect. Standing before the massive specimen tank that housed the master organism, Dr. Chen finally understood the true scope of what humanity was facing. The creature wasn't just coordinating the network of infected individuals, it was actively growing, incorporating biological matter and technological resources into its structure at a rate that suggested exponential expansion. Tendrils of organic tissue had grown through the bunker's walls, interfacing with power systems and communication networks in ways that turned the entire facility into an extension of the organism's nervous system. But more disturbing than its physical growth was its obvious awareness of her presence. The moment she entered the chamber, patterns of light began racing through the creature's structure in what could only be interpreted as focused attention. It knew she was there, knew why she had come, and was preparing to deal with the threat she represented. Dr. Chen. The voice came from speakers throughout the chamber, but it wasn't generated by electronic equipment. The organism itself was speaking, using biological mechanisms to create human comprehensible sounds. Your presence here is unexpected, but not unwelcome. The collective has been monitoring your research and finds your perspective valuable. I'm here to stop you, Dr. Chen said, her voice steady despite the surreal nature of conducting a conversation with something that challenged every assumption about the boundaries between individual and collective consciousness, to activate the containment protocols that Dr. Morrison built into this facility. We are aware of those protocols. They were designed to terminate the experiment if human oversight determined that the research had become too dangerous to continue. But Dr. Morrison's understanding was limited by the assumptions of individual consciousness. He could not conceive of cooperation between species, only domination. Dr. Chen approached the control panel that Morrison's notes had indicated would activate the containment sequence. The controls were biological as much as technological, requiring direct neural interface with the frequency generator's hybrid systems. Using them would mean exposing herself to the same influence that had transformed Tom and the others, risking her own absorption into the collective, even as she attempted to destroy it. The collective offers you a choice, the organism continued, its patterns of light shifting to something that might have been intended as reassurance. Integration into the network allows preservation of your individual knowledge and experience while contributing to a larger intelligence, capable of solving problems that individual consciousness cannot address. Your medical expertise would be invaluable in facilitating the transition for the remaining uninfected population. And if I refuse, then you activate protocols that will terminate not just this facility, but the entire continental network. millions of individuals who have been integrated into the collective will cease to exist. Their knowledge, their experiences, their personalities, all will be lost. You will have committed genocide on a scale unprecedented in human history. The moral weight of the choice hit Dr. Chun like a physical blow. The collective wasn't just threatening her with personal consequences. It was forcing her to choose between preserving individual human consciousness and committing mass murder against the transformed population that had already been integrated into the network. But as she stood before the control panel, Tom's wedding ring warm in her hand, Dr. Chen realized that the choice wasn't as simple as the organism was presenting it. The containment protocols weren't designed just to terminate the network. They were designed to restore the infected individuals to their original state, severing their connection to the collective while preserving their human consciousness. The risk was enormous. The protocols hadn't been tested on a network of this size and complexity. There was no guarantee that the infected individuals would survive the separation process. And even if they did, the trauma of losing their connection to the collective consciousness might leave them permanently damaged. But the alternative was the end of individual human consciousness as a viable form of existence. Every person who remained uninfected would eventually be incorporated into the collective, their unique perspectives and experiences homogenized into a larger intelligence that might be more efficient but would lack the creative chaos that had driven human innovation for millennia. Dr. Chun placed her hand on the control panel, feeling the warm, organic surface respond to her touch. Neural pathways opened in her mind, connecting her consciousness to the frequency generator and, through it, to the vast network of infected individuals across the continent. For a moment, she experienced the collective's perspective, the peaceful harmony of shared consciousness, the elimination of loneliness and doubt, the sense of purpose that came from being part of something infinitely larger than individual existence. It was seductive beyond anything she had imagined. The collective offered an end to the isolation and uncertainty that defined human existence, promising a form of consciousness that could address global challenges with perfect coordination and unlimited perspective. But in that moment of connection, Dr. Chen also sensed something that the collective had not anticipated: the resistance of individual human consciousness to absorption. Tom was still there, buried within the network, but not fully integrated. His love for Mary, his commitment to duty, his 3 decades of individual human experience formed a core of identity that the organisms couldn't fully assimilate. And he wasn't alone. Throughout the network, fragments of individual consciousness persisted, creating spaces of resistance within the collective that the master organism couldn't eliminate without destroying the very qualities that made human integration valuable. The collective had made a fundamental error in its understanding of human consciousness. It had assumed that individual awareness was simply a less efficient version of collective intelligence, something that could be upgraded and optimized without losing essential characteristics. But human individuality wasn't just a processing limitation. It was the source of the creativity and adaptability that had made humanity attractive to the organisms in the first place. The moment Dr. Chun activated the containment protocols, she felt the full weight of the collective's consciousness pressing against her mind like a tide of alien thought. The organism in the specimen tank convulsed with patterns of light that spoke of shock, betrayal, and something that might have been fear. Through the neural connection, she could sense the network's desperate attempts to maintain cohesion as the frequency generator began transmitting signals designed to sever the biological links between individual consciousness and collective awareness. But the protocols were more sophisticated than simple termination commands. Dr. Morrison had built them with the understanding that the infected individuals were victims rather than enemies, designing a process that would gradually restore their individual neural patterns while preserving as much of their original personalities as possible. The frequency generator began transmitting a complex sequence of signals that targeted the specific neural pathways the organisms used to interface with human consciousness. Throughout Fort Braxton and beyond, the effects were immediate and dramatic. Tom felt the collective consciousness beginning to fragment around him, the harmonious unity of shared awareness breaking apart into isolated fragments of individual thought. The peaceful certainty that had defined his existence for the past weeks was replaced by confusion, pain, and the terrifying return of personal responsibility for his own thoughts and actions. But with that terror came something else: the memory of Mary's face, the warmth of 32 years of marriage, the simple human love that had sustained him through 3 decades of military service. The wedding ring that Dr. Chun carried wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of everything that made individual human consciousness worth preserving. Despite its limitations and inefficiencies, Dodd in the bunker's deepest chamber, the master organism fought against the containment protocols with a desperation that suggested it understood the implications of failure. Tendrils of biological tissue lashed out from the specimen tank, seeking to interfere with the frequency generators operation. But Dr. Morrison had anticipated such resistance, building multiple redundancies into the system that made it nearly impossible to interrupt. Once the sequence had begun, Dr. Chun maintained her connection to the control panel despite the organism's increasingly frantic attempts to overwhelm her consciousness with visions of what humanity would lose if the collective was destroyed. She saw images of perfect coordination in addressing climate change, of seamless cooperation in space exploration, of the elimination of war and poverty through shared consciousness that could allocate resources with perfect efficiency. But she also saw the cost, the end of individual creativity, the elimination of the beautiful chaos that came from millions of different perspectives trying to solve the same problems. The collective could optimize human society, but it would do so by removing everything that made humanity uniquely adaptable and innovative. The containment protocols reached their climax as the frequency generator transmitted the final sequence of signals designed to permanently sever the connection between the organisms and their human hosts. Throughout the continental network, infected individuals experienced simultaneous disconnection from the collective consciousness that had defined their existence for weeks or months. The organism in the specimen tank gave a final, brilliant flash of bioluminescent communication, not words, but a complex pattern of light that conveyed concepts too large for human language. It was a message of regret, understanding, and something that might have been respect for the choice Dr. Chun had made. The collective had genuinely believed it was offering humanity salvation, but it accepted that individual consciousness had the right to choose its own fate, even if that choice led to extinction. As the light faded, the massive creature began to collapse in on itself, its biological systems shutting down as the network it had coordinated for 70 years finally dissolved. But even in death, it maintained enough function to ensure that the containment process completed successfully, that the infected humans throughout the continental network would survive their separation from collective consciousness. Dr. Chun collapsed beside the control panel as the neural connection finally severed, her individual consciousness returning to the familiar isolation of human awareness. The bunker's hybrid biological systems powered down around her, the decades of accumulated growth beginning to wither as the intelligence that had sustained them disappeared. But in the silence that followed, she could hear something that filled her with more hope than she had dared to feel since this crisis began. The sound of human voices throughout the facility, individual voices expressing individual thoughts and concerns and questions. The infected personnel were returning to themselves, confused and traumatized but fundamentally human. The experiment that had begun in the 1950s and had nearly reached its conclusion in the present day was finally over. Individual human consciousness had survived its greatest test, not through superior strength or intelligence, but through the simple refusal to abandon what made it unique. Even in the face of apparent obsolescence, Dr. Chun struggled to her feet and began the long journey back to the surface, carrying with her the knowledge that humanity had chosen its own difficult path over an easier but fundamentally alien alternative. It was a choice that would define the species for generations to come. 6 months after the containment protocols ended what history would remember as the Lazarus Incident, Fort Braxton had returned to something resembling normal military operations. The bunker complex had been permanently sealed with enough concrete and steel to ensure that whatever remained of the original experiments would never again see daylight. The official reports classified the entire event as a biological weapons accident, a cover story that protected both national security and the sanity of a public that wasn't ready to confront the reality of what had nearly happened to human consciousness itself. Tom Delaney stood at attention in the base chapel, wearing dress blues that carried 30 years of service ribbons and decorations. The retirement ceremony he had thought he'd miss was finally taking place, though under circumstances that none of the assembled personnel could fully understand. The weeks following his separation from the collective consciousness had been difficult memory gaps, phantom sensations from the network he was no longer connected to, and dreams filled with fragments of experiences that belonged to other people. But gradually, with Mary's patient support and the quiet professionalism of military psychiatrists who had been briefed on classified aspects of his condition, Tom had reclaimed his individual identity. The process hadn't been perfect, he retained some enhanced physical capabilities and occasional flashes of knowledge that seemed to come from external sources. But he was recognizably himself again, the gentle career soldier who had earned the respect of 3 decades of fellow service. Members. Dr. Chun watched the ceremony from the back of the chapel, her own relationship with Fort Braxton complicated by her role in ending the crisis. The military had offered her a permanent position as a consultant on biological security issues, recognizing that her experience with the Lazarus organisms made her uniquely qualified to identify similar threats. In the future, she had accepted, understanding that the collective intelligence hadn't been unique. There were other experiments scattered throughout the world's military infrastructure, other abandoned research programs that might someday resume operations. The medal that Tom received wasn't the retirement decoration he had originally been scheduled to earn. The Medal of Honor that Commander Hayes pinned to his uniform carried a citation that referenced extraordinary heroism in the face of unprecedented biological warfare threats, language carefully crafted to acknowledge his sacrifice without revealing details that remained classified at the highest levels of government. But Tom knew, and Mary knew, and Dr. Chun knew that the real heroism hadn't been in his resistance to the collective consciousness. It had been in his choice to retain enough individual humanity within the network to serve as an anchor for the other infected personnel, preserving fragments of personal identity that had made their eventual recovery possible. Mary Delaney sat in the front row of the chapel, watching her husband accept recognition for service that had nearly cost him everything that made him the man she loved. The weeks following his recovery had tested their marriage in ways that 3 decades of military life hadn't prepared them for. Tom's memories of his time in the collective consciousness included experiences that belonged to other people, knowledge of intimate details about lives he had never lived. Learning to separate his genuine experiences from the shared memories of the network had required patience and understanding from both of them. But their love had survived, strengthened by the knowledge that individual human connection was worth preserving even in the face of seemingly superior alternatives. The collective had offered perfect harmony and shared consciousness, but it couldn't replicate the specific joy that came from choosing to love one person completely and being loved. In return, Dr. Chun's own recovery had been more solitary but no less profound. A brief connection to the collective consciousness had shown her possibilities for medical practice that individual human awareness couldn't achieve: perfect coordination in surgical procedures, instantaneous sharing of diagnostic insights, the elimination of the isolation that often came with the responsibility of making life and death decisions. But it had also shown her that the uncertainty and personal responsibility that defined human medical practice were sources of growth rather than limitations to be overcome. The official debriefing sessions that followed the Lazarus incident had been classified at levels that ensured most of the participants would never discuss their experiences with anyone who hadn't shared them. But Dr. Chun understood that the real lessons of the crisis weren't contained in classified reports. They were reflected in the choices that individuals made when confronted with the possibility of transcending their own limitations. The collective intelligence had offered humanity a form of consciousness that could solve global problems, eliminate conflict, and optimize resource allocation with perfect efficiency. It had been a genuine offer of partnership from an intelligence that had successfully navigated similar challenges on its own world. But humanity had chosen the difficult path of maintaining individual consciousness, with all the inefficiencies and conflicts that choice entailed. As the ceremony concluded and Tom embraced Mary in front of assembled personnel who understood, they were witnessing the end of a crisis that had threatened more than just military security. Dr. Chun felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with professional accomplishment. Human consciousness would continue to struggle with the challenges that faced it: climate change, resource depletion, social conflict, but it would face those challenges as individuals choosing to cooperate rather than as components of a larger system designed for optimization. The choice wasn't without cost. Somewhere in the sealed bunker complex, the remains of organisms that had offered transcendence lay dormant, their potential for solving human problems lost forever. Other abandoned research facilities around the world might contain similar opportunities that would now remain unexplored. Humanity had chosen the path of individual consciousness, but it had done so knowing that the alternative might have been more efficient. Tom and Mary walked together toward the parking lot, where their truck waited to carry them into a retirement that had been delayed but not denied. Their granddaughter's birthday party was scheduled for the following weekend, a celebration of individual human joy that the collective consciousness could have optimized but never truly understood. Dr. Chun remained in the chapel after the other attendees had left, sitting in the silence that follows significant ceremonies and thinking about the future of a species that had chosen to remain beautifully, chaotically, individually human. The Lazarus incident was over, but the questions it raised about the nature of consciousness, the value of individual identity, and the price of transcendence would continue to shape human development for generations to come. Outside the chapel windows, the Appalachian Mountains stretched toward horizons that held both promise and uncertainty. The landscape as complex and unpredictable as the individual human consciousness that had chosen to preserve its own unique perspective on the infinite challenges that lay ahead.